Welcome to the Booster Pack. My name is Rands, and this is the show where we unwrap the stories and crack the mysteries of collectible games each and every episode. And on today's show, I hope you've worn your Doc Martens and you have a spare set of batteries for your Game Boy Color, because we are going to be once again stepping back to that fat decade, the 1990s. Yes, it was the decade that spawned the entire collectible game genre, and by my count, gave us at least 90 different games in English for it. So to join us on this little time walk today, we have a very special guest, somebody who's worked on a few of these games, but they haven't just worked on 1 or 2 of these games, or 5 or even 10 of these games. Oh no, in some capacity or another, our guest worked on at least 11 of the collectible games released through that first couple of years in the 1990s, which is an absolutely mind-twisting statistic when you think about the fact that that means they worked on 12% of all collectible games that were released in that time. Wow. While we let that sink in for you as well, I will mention a couple of other things. Between those collectible game designs, in fact, they also skillfully executed another game design of their very own. Something that was very well acclaimed and went on to win an Origin Award for its best traditional card game category in the year that it was released. That game clearly is heads above the rest of the competition and is in fact now, 25 years later, still in print. That game is, of course, Guillotine. You may have heard of it. Since then, of course, our guest has never stopped having a game-centric career and ported over his skills into the digital space to work on many high-profile projects as well. Those projects included the Astaria MMORPG, the Bejeweled series of app games, and even a digital collectible game for the Plants vs. Zombies franchise. However, it's always going to be in the tabletop and hobby game space where our guest's name will ring out the loudest, because they, over the last few decades, have given us some delightful titles and pleased their fans by helping create games like Unexploded Cow, the Pathfinder adventure card game, and perhaps most notably, AEG's smash hit, Smash Up. But as much as I love all of those games, unfortunately, we ain't going to be covering many of them today, because we are going to be focusing in on that 12% of collectible games that they created throughout the 1990s. So it is, without further ado, I am absolutely ecstatic to welcome to the Booster Pack, finally, somebody who has had their hand in more trading card games than they've got fingers. It is, of course, the father of shuffle building, Paul Peterson. Paul, how do you do, man?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Jazz hands.
Jazz hands.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. And as we know, there is so much we could talk about, but we're going to start at the tip of the iceberg and sort of just dive into those early years of your career when you were making those randomized collectible card games that were a newfangled thing in the 1990s era. So let's start before that even, though, and you can just tell me a little bit about what sort of drew you to hobby gaming in general and what sort of got you into the whole hobby game side of things and attracted you to this genre.
Well, I mean, I've always been a gamer. Growing up, we had games around the house, Monopoly. Everybody has Monopoly when they're growing up. You know, Sorry, like we had a lot of board games and we played a bunch of board games, and I've always been really interested in that kind of thing. And then, you know, when I hit 10, to sort of give you an idea of how old I actually am, started getting into Dungeons and Dragons when the first edition Dungeons and Dragons, you know, and just I've always been a gamer and I've always loved games, and I've made friends with people who loved games, and we've always played games together. So
that's amazing. So you obviously gravitated to that side of hobby gaming and stuff like that. Now, well, tell me, obviously you were going along, you were playing your things like Dungeons and Dragons, and like a, no pun intended, but a lightning bolt, a specific game comes out and changes everything about hobby gaming. But tell me, what was your first experience with a CCG, which I assume might have been Magic the Gathering?
It was, in fact, Magic the Gathering. We could talk about examples of things that were similar that happened before that, but they are somewhat unimportant. It was the lightning bolt. It was the stone that caused the avalanche. Absolutely. At the time I was working at Microsoft in customer service, so that was an awesome point in my life. And it came out, and I discovered it, and my friends discovered it, and we just started buying tons and building decks, which was an amazing new thing that you could do. It's like, wait, I get to decide what I'm playing with? That's amazing. And yeah, just got into it that way and just dove right in. In fact, that's kind of how I ended up working on them in the first place.
Well, let's go into that. But before we do, you got me a little curious there. You were working at Microsoft, and if, you know, I wouldn't be much of a history buff if I didn't know that was around about the 1993 era. Huge year for that company.
It was.
Oh, pardon me?
I wasn't a tech guy. I come out of my studies were in astrophysics, actually. But I was front lines. I was the guy that you would call if you had needed help with, get this, Windows 3.1. So call me and I tell you whether or not you get support.
Yeah. What does it mean, open a window?
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, so that I was answering those phones and later answering phones for like Access and early, you know, bigger programs and things like that. But yeah.
Wow. So a bit of a customer service background at that time. Again, it would have been an amazing company to be working for in that wild era where it was changing. Again, another lightning bolt to a different industry. But I guess my question then would be, you said, you know, that's sort of how you led into working on collectible games. How do we, you know, thread that story together? Because how do you jump from one of the biggest companies in Seattle to one of the soon to be biggest companies in Seattle in a different industry?
So in the early days, this is mid 90s, right? So when I'm playing Magic and I get involved in they didn't have forums back then. They had they had a mailing list. It was Magic-L. And so if you had a question, you would type your question into, you'd send it to Magic-L, you'd email it to Magic-L, and one of the people at Wizards of the Coast, which was, say, I was the 75th employee. So there's like 40 or 50 people at the time that this all begins. And you'd send in your question. Very complicated game, very new. This is way before they understood like how templating works and things like that. So many questions, right? So they have abilities like banding, which, you know, is almost impossible to explain today, right? And so you type in your question and you'd send it off to there, and everybody on the mailing list would get it. And so they'd see your question and they'd see when it got answered, and we're all in this giant email chain, basically. Well, the people at Wizards of the Coast are very busy, like trying their best to deal with the success that is happening around them, right? And they don't have a dedicated customer service department. They're just like, they're doing their best. And so some of the people that are regulars on Magic-L, including me, just start answering questions. Like the same questions come up all the time. And so we're answering them all the time. And we start building boilerplate answers for, like, somebody's like, hey, what does banding do? And we just send it to the mailing list, because they come in and they don't see all the previous stuff. They just see what comes after it, right? So we start doing that, essentially. We start doing the customer service job.
And you had the experience.
Right, exactly. And actually, before too long, I'm like one of the more prolific guys, answering questions and coming up with new answers for questions and things when people ask questions we haven't seen before. And I'm doing all of this stuff, and I get contacted by Wizards, and they're like, "Hey, do you want to keep doing this Magic-L thing? We'll like actually send you product and stuff, and you'll be the guy. You'll be Magic-L, essentially." Right.
So basically, a net rep of sorts.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. I was the Magic-L guy, essentially. And I was like, yeah, that's amazing. That sounds awesome, right? And I'll get free booster packs and stuff, and that'll be fun, no problem. So I started doing the Magic-L thing, and I'm still working at Microsoft doing the Magic-L thing. And then WotC's exploding, and they're like, you know what? We need a customer service department. Wouldn't that be great? And they start like hiring people for customer service, and they're like, would you like to come in for an interview? And I was like, sure, that sounds great. And I was kind of their dream, essentially, because they were hiring really good people, but they weren't hiring people who like came from a Microsoft customer service background, right? They didn't have procedures. They didn't have any of that stuff. And so me, now Magic expert, Magic rules expert, and customer service guy came in, and it was a match made in heaven, essentially. And so I started working there, and that's how I got into Wizards of the Coast.
The foot in the door, so to speak. And it's really amazing how those message boards, like Usenet, and how those mailing lists really were a gateway for so many people. I've spoken to a couple of people on this in previous episodes, and some of them have had very similar stories. Answering rules questions have led to actually being, either first going to customer service or even being brought onto a design team wholesale.
There's a lot of parallels in computer gaming too, where a lot of game designers came out of QA. Like, they're very analytical. They know the game inside and out, and so then they just start being able to say, well, what if we did this, and what if we did this, and it's a chain of skills essentially. Yeah.
So if you can remember, like, obviously the first couple of years of Magic sort of have a legendary status, and almost month by month people can break them down and sort of understand things. It was really like the birth of everything. So can you remember? I'm not sure if you would be able to, but when did you actually like start there? Like, are we talking 93 or are we talking a little bit later?
So just before I started working there, one of the things they brought a bunch of people who were sort of around them, like Magic-L and people's husbands and wives and employees, and to do flavor text for that. The first thing I can remember working on Magic was the flavor text for Ice Age.
Okay, so that puts us at about late 94, early 95, maybe?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was flavor text, so it was way before it was printed. So it was earlier than that. Like my official start date was like, I want to say June of 94, I think, something like that.
Around about Legends time.
Yeah, exactly. So I started working there right around when Legends was coming out.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and in fact, my first year in customer service, I went to like 20 conventions or something like that, and we were selling Legends at the time. So sitting at a little table with our few boxes that we brought with us, with a line out the door, giving like one booster pack at a time to people. So
yeah, let's be honest, Paul. Legends was selling itself.
No, yeah, totally. No. I was there to be a person and to answer questions and things like that. And I mean, there were still, yeah, Legends was selling itself. People were crazy to get it, but there were also a bunch of people who were just like, why is there this line out the door for this little table with these people that's got this crappy little sign that because we had not really done much yet, right? This brand new company and things they'd never heard of. So
I've heard other previous Wizards employees call that sort of era, that sort of 93 to sort of 95, 96 era, sort of like that Wild West of sort of gaming companies. It was sort of making, like you said, they were having trouble keeping up with the success, let alone trying to create success. Do you have any memories from that time? I mean, I've read that Peter Atkinson, the CEO of the company, was aiming to make like a gaming utopia. Do you have any memories that stand out from before you sort of moved into the more serious side of things, from that sort of wild time, even a convention maybe?
Sure. I mean, I have lots of memories from that time, like going to conventions. We went to a convention one time that was in the Panhandle of Florida. And it was on an island a mile offshore with a bridge that went out to the island, right? And it was just amazing. Like, then it's like a one hotel convention out there in the middle of nowhere. We get in, everything's closed when we get in, so we have to like walk a mile across a bridge to get to the Waffle House. But my fond memories of that are like the next day we're in the little dealer's hall, we're selling stuff, and I look out and there's a beach because it's on a tiny little island, and there's dolphins going up through the surf, and it's like, how can you get much better? You're just like selling magic and dolphins are frolicking 100 feet away from you. It's amazing.
I mean, you can't really get much better of a gaming utopia than that. Selling magic there and then watching dolphins play. That's amazing. That's basically paradise brought there. Now,
and there's just so many little stories like that, little conventions we go to. And Gen Con, my first time at Gen Con, and this huge experience of seeing all of these companies that I'd played their games but never really interacted with. And yeah, it's amazing.
It's absolutely a wild time. And obviously, as we sort of mentioned, it was this sort of boom in the industry, and it sort of shaped and changed things to come. But let's jump forward a little bit. Let's jump into you working into the sort of more crunchier side of things. So you were saying you're in customer service and you're answering phones and answering rules questions and stuff like that. And much like that comparison you said before, a lot of QA people who know the games inside out end up transitioning to game design. How did that work from you going from CS to game design, or Wizards R&D as they'd call it?
So I was in customer service and a rules expert, but it was a very small company, and not only we're working on Magic, and actually, when I started, most of the design team hadn't actually moved out to Seattle yet. Like Richard was out here, but most of the rest of his design team, the people who had originally made it in Pennsylvania, were still in Pennsylvania. And they came out not too long after that. But like the number of people that are around and the company's exploding, but we still need people to work on things. So Richard was there all the time. And what I most fondly remember is there's a game called Robo Rally, which is actually like deep in the history of how Magic the Gathering got made. It's because of Robo Rally that Magic the Gathering got made. But so he's there, and Robo Rally's still not out yet, but we're at night, like until late in the night, we're playing, Robo Rally with Richard, and we're play testing games, and we're talking about stuff. Like he and I would stay up super late just talking about strategies and about how to fix the boards and the rules and all kinds of things. And basically from that and from my experiences with the other designers on the team, they went to Peter and they said, hey, we think Paul would be better as a game designer than as a customer service person. So they advocated for me, and it's hard to get when people are like, well, how'd you break into the industry? How do I break into the industry? And I'm like, well, you get the other game designers to notice you and tell everybody that you need to be a game designer. That's not the best answer, really, but
I mean, a pretty good answer is hand selected by Richard Garfield himself. I mean.
Exactly. Anointed from on high by Richard, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, you can't get much of a better start than that, I think. Now, I guess that obviously we mentioned Robo Rally, which was, as you mentioned, the game that sort of brought Richard to Wizards before Magic came out, and sort of there's a big story there that's great for another episode. But with Richard, like, what was your first sort of impression of him? Obviously you've been playing Magic before, you'd seen the rule books that all say Richard Garfield, PhD, whatever. Like, what was your impression the first time you sort of met him? Like, were you intimidated? Was it something that was really, you just sort of got along with him easy? Tell me all about that.
Richard's not intimidating. Richard is the friendliest guy on the planet. Instantly, just digging in, talking games, talking whatever geeky thing. He's like the nicest person on the planet, and there was no sort of intimidation. I mean, there's a little bit when you're first and then he just walks in with Robo Rally stuff. He's like, "Who wants to play?" And you just start and talking and laughing, and yeah.
Awesome. And obviously, he's somebody who knows how to create fun, and you obviously spoke his language as well. So that's really fascinating. So now that you're in R&D at this point in the story, tell me all about what you remember your first impacts on a collectible card game were. Do Magic, obviously you were working on the flavor text, you said, but do you remember if there was any sort of opinions you gave on design or anything like that as far as the game mechanics go at that early stage?
Yeah, the first games I worked on were, to a certain extent, like Fallen Empires, Homelands, those kind of games, like some amount of input. But I was really junior, and I was just sort of helping them as much as possible. I mean, I'd have ideas and stuff, but it was, their show, and I was, working on stuff, and it built up a little bit. Like when we started doing things like Chronicles, help pick out which cards should be in Chronicles and things, because it was an amalgam set from previous stuff. So those were sort of like my first tasks, working on, and just like every upcoming set, start play testing, start saying this number's wrong, that number's wrong, this kind of thing. So yeah, those were my first forays into the CCG world.
Wow. All right. And then eventually, from, tweaking these couple of numbers, or maybe even just, at the back of a meeting saying, oh, maybe it should say target or something like that. Maybe you go from that to, from my understanding, almost leading the second product after Magic the Gathering in the collectible game space that Wizards is making, which is at the time was Jihad, but then metamorphosized into something else. Tell us all about that.
Yeah. In fact, we were in a meeting and Peter came in. I don't remember what we were talking about. But Peter came in. He's like, "Hey, Paul, we need somebody to." So Jihad was out, right? And it had come out, and they had realized very quickly that maybe the name was a big problem.
I'm sure that didn't last very long in the market, just without any controversy.
Right. This is early, and it's the Wild West.
And for those who don't know as well, we should probably mention that that's a word that comes from the role-playing game in which it's based on. It's based on the Vampire the Masquerade game, and that sort of comes from that word, which means a giant war, essentially.
Right, exactly. exactly, and it doesn't have the same connotations within the vampire world as it does in the real world. And so, and you know, Wizards is being edgy, and they're partnered with White Wolf at the time, which is like putting out this game that's super edgy about vampires and werewolves and all of this stuff. So anyways, between that and some other problems that we had at the launch, they decided, you know what we're going to do? We're just going to relaunch the game, and it's, instead of Jihad, it's going to be Vampire: The Eternal Struggle, and we're going to just sort of re-examine everything as we go. And so Peter came in and he's like, look, we need somebody to lead this. We need somebody to turn Jihad into VtES. And everybody else in this room has been working on Magic the Gathering since Richard had the idea, and we need them to continue doing that. So Paul, go do VtES.
And what did you do to sort of make that shift? Obviously, it wasn't a huge mechanical overhaul, but there was some changes. So tell me about taking this sort of thing and sort of being handed the reins of the, you know, at the time, I think the third ever collectible card game, and probably the second biggest at the time, onto your shoulders. Tell me all about that.
That was an interesting time. I was still pretty junior. I'm going to be honest and say that while I'm proud of the game that we came out with and what we did with it over the years, definitely, like, looking back on it with my, 25 years of experience now, there's a lot of things more I would have done with it. I was sort of a little timid about changing Richard's vision and Richard's thing. And Richard was totally like, do what you think is right, Paul. And I was like, okay. And, we made some changes and we cleaned a lot of stuff up and we took out some stuff and we did a lot of play testing about, like, should we limit it so that the whole, like, fight between obfuscation and discovery, whether those things can just pile up forever or put some limitations on it, like whether the whole political thing should just leave or whatever, like all of this stuff. We did a huge amount of testing, and like I said, I'm very proud of what came out of it. But in hindsight, it's like, we could have removed so much more and made it so much cleaner. But yeah, so put in charge of that, and I mean, I ran that for as long as Wizard had it, basically. So from that time all the way forward, and we made a bunch of different expansions for it over the years, and yeah, it was an awesome time for doing that, definitely.
It was, and that game has gone down as a legendary status. It was really the first multiplayer collectible card game, and it really sort of has a loved following. People who love the theme and who love that political side, and even, Magic the Gathering sort of catching up now with their Commander format, where they've got, a multiplayer built-in sort of format as well, and that game sort of led that way at Wizards of the Coast. So I guess just very quickly, to what extent was, just to tread our conversations together so far, what extent was Richard involved in this recrafting into from Jihad into Vampire: The Eternal Struggle at all, or was that all on your reins?
He was always available, but he didn't actually do a lot at that time. I mean, Magic, he like all of his time was Magic and doing games that he was in love with, like Robo Rally, getting it out and stuff. And not too long after I started doing that, there was sort of this, Peter and Richard came to me and said, hey, we've got the Netrunner license, or we've got the license for Cyberpunk, and we want to do a game about Cyberpunk. And I was working with Richard on the game, and me and him were working on it. Then basically, like, Vampire was, like, Richard and I did a lot of initial, like, brainstorming and stuff, and made some little prototypes and stuff, which was a huge amount of fun and a huge, I treasure that time. But very quickly, he just went on. He needed to. He couldn't wait for me, and I was too busy, like, still doing some Magic stuff and being in charge of VtES. And it was all of the stuff that you see in Netrunner was his idea. There's almost nothing in the initial game design that was anything I worked on. He had the idea of making it, the Corp versus Runner, and the card decks were different, the cards were different, and everything. That's all Richard. I enjoyed the stuff we worked on, but and it was a great time, but yeah.
That's amazing. So obviously, you know, like you said, Richard's working on this game and obviously helping you shepherd it. And this, you know, you're still working on Vampire: The Eternal Struggle at the time, and this sort of umbrella sort of starts to form over these games that Richard's deciding outside of Magic called Deckmaster, which you can see on the back of cards of like VtES and Jihad, of course, and of course Netrunner. So let's talk about Netrunner now that you've sort of brought it up. So obviously you said, you know, you helped tweaking and stuff like that. Do you have any recollection of sort of the development and the changes that that game went through? Because that game, for, you know, lack of a better term, has often looked as sort of like the Citizen Kane of collectible card games. It is like the one that people will point to and say, you know, have you tried this? Because it is, you know, the Citizen Kane or the Watchmen of its own genre. So tell me about what you remember that game, how that game shaped and formed in that time.
That's a good question. Like I said, at some point it became sort of like Richard ran with it and other people formed around it, and a lot of it happened without, you know, I would help play test and things like that. And I think I worked on the first expansion, I think it was, as well. But yeah, a lot of it happened sort of outside of my purview at the time, other than just as a general, like all the R&D members worked on everything all the time to some extent. But I mean, I remembered very early on, like some of the strategies started to form and they were super exciting about like, and the whole like hiding things and bluffing and all of that was super exciting. I loved every moment of that.
So do you remember it from day one? Like it is and the reason I think a lot of people point to it as being sort of, you know, the tentpole of critical acclaim in the genre is that it's asymmetrical, something that almost no other collectible card game or living card game in the case of Android Netrunner has ever really achieved very well. So tell me, do you remember, was it always asymmetrical? Was there other versions that you remember where it wasn't or anything like that?
I mean, early versions that Richard and I, you know, worked on or thought about were like, oh, there'll be, you know, data. We're both playing runners and data's flowing down a stream and we're attacking it and trying to capture it. Like the early versions of things were not asymmetric, and that was sort of the revolution that sent Richard off and me no longer able to sort of keep up with what he was doing. Was as soon as he was like, no, it's going to be asymmetric. One player is going to play this way and the other player is going to go this way. And I was like, that's amazing, that's brilliant. And he needed to run off with that. So I was not as able to help him with that at that point. So yeah.
So that's just interesting. You just said something there. You know, you were both playing runners and there was data streams and you were both trying to grab as much data. Was this, would you call this sort of like almost like a PvE thing, but like obviously, was it like a deck or something like that that represented that data?
Yeah, there was a deck that there was a separate deck that represented the data that was coming off that this is just one of the versions we played with. So and the one I probably remember the most is, yeah, there was data flowing off and we were also interfering with each other's runs and playing cards that represented what the corps were doing, like playing ice on things so the other player couldn't get to them and things. Like, if I remember correctly, this is 25 years ago, there was like data was in the middle and you could play ice on their side so that they couldn't get to the data and you could try to get to the data. I don't remember the game being really good, but we liked some of the things at the time. And obviously it wasn't good enough because Richard, you know, went off in a different direction of it. But I remember those ideas and working on those ideas.
Well, thank you so much for sharing those memories. I know that obviously Netrunner has a ton of fans, and hearing something like that is very, very fascinating to people who have loved that game now for almost, you know, not quite, but coming up to 30 years in a couple of years' time. So it's really sort of fascinating. So we're talking about this sort of Deckmaster sort of umbrella of games, which included games like VtES and also included games like Netrunner. Of course, the next one that sort of comes along is sort of Battletech. Were you involved in that in any way?
Yes, yeah, very much so. I was on the team. I wasn't. They were sort of like, well, Paul, you're leading VtES, but I was on the team from the beginning.
Do you remember anything like mechanically that you guys played with Battletech, or any interesting stories from that sort of development over the couple of years that game ran? Because again, that was another one that people I think look back on and think that was a very skill testing game.
It absolutely was, and it also like. It borrowed from a lot of DNA from a lot of things, like the playing things back here and putting counters on them, and then people trying to get in and do it. Like that had some Netrunner DNA, right? That you had where you were building, and that people could try to get to what you were building. It had, you know, magic stuff where there's, you know, you've got your essentially like monsters out there fighting each other on the battlefield and all of that stuff. So yeah, it was really fun to see like evolutions of ideas that like Magic was had its own path and was doing its own things, but it was interesting to see how you could take some of those ideas and move them in different directions. For example, I remember a lot of challenges at the time because like part of the whole story of the inner sphere versus the people who'd left and came back was that they'd left, gotten hugely powerful in tech, and then they came back and were just stomping on everybody. And the inner sphere had heart and they had tech, and like trying to capture those feelings and be like, well, all of their mechs are better. How do we represent the fact that if I'm playing Steiner and I'm from the inner sphere and you're Jaguar and you're coming in and all of your stuff is way better than mine, how do we represent that in the game? And so all of that was an interesting challenge for sure.
Well, not to diverge our conversation too much, and we will get back to the Deckmaster stuff, but just hearing you speak about those 3 separate games and how you infuse the flavor with these different types of strategies and what you were trying to invoke really does remind me of the sort of smash up philosophy that you've been able to sort of embrace. Like you've been like, how do I meld these 3 different things or these different themes and genres into it? I really love seeing this historical sort of CCG experience that you had sort of flow into the games that you're working on and assisting you so much in the modern day. It's fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt Smash Up has huge DNA from my CCG time. Like, you're essentially very simply deck building. Take 2 things and put them together and you've got a deck, right? 2 things you like. And that's what building decks in Magic is even like. You're just sort of like most are a large number of decks in Magic are 2 colors. And you're like, well, I really like direct damage from red and I really like counter spells from blue. So I'm going to put them together. And that's deep in the DNA of Smash Up. Absolutely.
If you've ever drafted, that's pretty much the entire strategy, right?
Yeah, right, exactly.
So let's just talk a little bit now. Let's jump back to Deckmaster. So Deckmaster sort of has a sort of, like I said, an umbrella, a term that sort of meant, I have passed from what I've heard from other people who worked at WotC at that time. Sort of, it was like the non-Magic sort of center of things, right? How did it feel being sort of like the lead Deckmaster guy in sort of the heyday of Magic at Wizards of the Coast?
That was an interesting feeling because as time went on, I sort of became the guy who worked on things that weren't that, right? Like I wasn't in charge of Battletech, but then as we started moving into other things, I was in charge of them, or I was handed them, and that's not true for everything, but like I worked on a whole bunch of stuff that wasn't Magic for a long time. And I tried to keep on top of Magic as much as possible during that time. And in fact, I came back to it during the Brothers War stuff. I worked on Apocalypse. I was the lead designer for Apocalypse, for example. So, I kept my toes in essentially. I kept up to date and stuff, but no, I was always sort of like, well, it's not Magic. So let's give it to one of the other guys, and that was often me. So I don't want to say that because like Tom Wiley was in charge of the MLB, which is a huge success story, and he was from the get-go the guy for that, absolutely, things like that. So I wasn't in charge of everything, but I was in charge of a lot of games.
Yeah, it's absolutely phenomenal to see that these games got sort of brought out in that time, and at the from Wizards' very first ever marketing about the trading card game genre, Deckmaster was going to be the umbrella in which they released things like Magic, was just the fantasy wing. And, then Jihad was going to come out, and that was going to be the thing. And then there was going to be a sci-fi wing and a cyberpunk thing and all that sort of stuff. So it's really fascinating how invested Wizards of the Coast was as a company to sort of bring out this diverse spectrum of collectible card games. Obviously, Magic was sort of always going to be the sort of golden child, the crown child in that sort of collective. But as years sort of started to move on, how did you feel that the priorities from obviously Magic the Gathering always being number one, but the priorities for the Deckmaster line started to shift?
That's a good question. I mean, it became more and more about, if it wasn't Magic, it was going to be something licensed and bigger and bigger licenses, or at least ones that were more and more interesting. Like, we from Battletech, I'm not 100% sure on my timelines, but like some of the next big things I worked on were Xena and Hercules, for example, which were huge TV shows at the time. And the whole idea of making a lighter version of Magic, essentially. Like if you've played those games, they are very much Magic the Gathering with a much more simplified format, essentially.
So let me just, I mean, again, I'm just a casual observer who's looked back on it, and I just want to get your opinion of it, of course. And I think what you've called out there is fantastic. So we essentially have this Deckmaster umbrella where Richard designs 3 or 4 games, if you include Magic, but 3 of them are put under this umbrella, where you've got VtES, you've got Netrunner, and you've got Battletech. Then after that, you know, we sort of discover that those 3 games aren't performing like Magic is. So what we do is Wizards of the Coast moves into this sort of new realm of licensing, which is, you know, obviously things like companies like Decipher was doing at the time with Star Wars and Star Trek. And there was a couple of other games, you know, ICE was, Iron Crown was doing things with Middle Earth at that time. But Wizards of the Coast introduces what's called an ARC system, which is a sort of a watered down, pardon the expression.
Not at all. It is 100% Magic Light. It was designed to be a more approachable version of Magic. Absolutely.
Yeah. So essentially, for those who don't know, it's essentially a 3-color system instead of a 5-color system: red, blue, and green. And like you said, it used franchises like Xena and franchises like Hercules, and even a own created comic book franchise by Jim Lee.
C23, yeah.
C23, which I'm sure is a fascinating story that we won't have time to dig into here. But those sort of things, it's very interesting. And what was your role as the shift went from these Deckmaster games, where they're all very different designs that Richard had done, to this sort of like Magic Light, as you put it, version of things? Like, tell me about how your role shifted once the Battletech and stuff started to fade away and these more licensed games started coming in with the ARC system specifically.
Well, I mean, each of them has their own story. Like, ARC system was very much designed like, let's see if we can capture Magic, distill it down into something simpler, and then give it to an audience that likes mass market things like Xena and Hercules. Like, the audience that likes Xena and Hercules and the audience that likes Vampire, there's a Venn diagram for sure, but we're trying to give it to people who are not necessarily going to be able to take Magic on, right? Aren't going to be able to understand, or, you know, aren't going to want to figure out banding and try to play the game like that, right?
But those who do discover it through Xena and Hercules can jump to Magic, because there is that similarity.
Yeah, there definitely, that was an idea that, you know, once they're into here, then they, and like Wizards, even around these times, was also experimenting with like Portal, which was a similar kind of thing, but not quite. It's a different way to distill Magic down and make it simpler. Like, there's no instants and interrupts and things like that, right? But I mean, that was just like one of the stories, because at the same time we're doing MLB, which was a huge success for us, and it's a CCG and it's a totally different thing. I was one of the designers for the NFL game. If you remember the NFL game that we made, like a little electronic thing,
play grid or something.
There was electronic device that read the cards that so like, we're experimenting with all of these things. Like, can we distill Magic? Can we make a game that uses these, you know, which license did we get in? I mean, we really wanted to, like, which licenses do we think are cool, and how does that game work? Like, there's no way we'd make MLB and like make it a distilled form of Magic, right? It's not about, you know, playing players and them attacking and blocking and things like that. That you have to go way outside the hand waving realms to get to that. But
I can't imagine what an enchantment in a MLB game would be.
Exactly. You're
corking the bat.
Pine tar on your bat, right? Yeah, exactly.
Well, let's just, before we move on from it, let's just talk a little bit more about ARC System, because ARC System, I think, was a fantastic idea that really sort of could have been something really amazing, but it was sort of coming to the end of that sort of flushing boom that the 90s saw from collectible games, if I'm sort of putting it in, you know, in chronological order. And what do you remember about like working on that, and what do you remember about like discussions about other IPs, and was there anything else that was planned for it that never sort of came out, or was it just immediately sort of something that was tried and then let go?
Yeah, I think it was more sort of like we said, okay, well, we're doing C23 as an internal property. Like, we're going to create this, and the bugs and Jim Lee and all that stuff. Very cool idea. We're going to own this portion of it. And then we're going to try it out with this license of Xena and these pair of licenses, which are, you know, intertwined licenses of Xena and Hercules. And we'll see how those do. And then we'll figure out if we're going to do other things later. So I don't remember any specific discussions about like other licenses we might chase with this, because we did it. It was tremendous fun. I went down to Universal Studios like a bunch of times to look through pictures and meet with them and talk about how the game's going and things like. I mean, we didn't have Zoom, so a lot more was flying down to California and talking to them about stuff, right? So, but I mean, I had a great time working on that. I became a fan. I think I was like mildly a fan before that, but like just like being steeped in Xena and Hercules the whole time was a tremendous amount of fun. And it also taught me a huge amount of working with licenses. Like in other relationships that we'd had, like with Jihad and with Battletech and stuff, we would have, sort of like occasionally something would crop up where it would be like we might have some difficulty, or they might be like, oh, I don't think it should work that way, or things like that. But like Xena and Hercules is a multimedia thing with a TV show and everything, so they were much more like, nope, you can't do that. Nope, you can't do that. That thing can't do that. And we'd say, like, oh, well, what if we wheedle about this or that or the other thing? So it's and just like going down and being like, hey, I need a picture of this. And they're like, yeah, we can't do that. They wrapped filming 6 months ago. These pictures were taken by a cameraman who was on set. We can't just like, make a picture happen, right? If we don't have one, it's that kind of thing. Just the discussions about like, can we use a screen grab? Well, is it going to be high enough quality? All of that stuff. So
that's amazing. Like, obviously, I was going to ask you what lessons you learned from working on something like that, and you just answered that question fantastically. And again, it's one of those ones that now that Smash Up is starting to evolve into being, a license thing. We've had Marvel come out. I heard that there's a Disney princess coming as well. A Disney franchise one is coming as well. So obviously, these are all, again, those CCG lessons that get played into this game that you're very famous for now.
Right, and now I get to work through the OP, the company that is the publisher of it, with partnership with AEG, but they're the ones who hold those licenses with Disney and with Marvel, and so it's there's like this interesting multi-layered relationship of the OP, like, hey, we'd like things to be kind of like this, okay, great, and then but we have to go ask Disney, okay, so
just so that's tiered system of just checks and balances, bureaucracy at its best.
Yeah, totally.
Now, obviously, that wasn't your first experiences with licenses, and there's a big one coming up towards the end of the episode that we'll get to a little bit later. But your career in that 90s sort of basically, because Wizards of the Coast started the collectible card game, sort of led the way on how the genre arced throughout those first sort of 7 or 8 years. Now, as we were saying before, you went through this period of Magic and then these other sort of gaming licenses like, Vampire, Battletech, Cyberpunk, all that sort of stuff came through. Then you sort of started realizing that, like the Decipher thing, you understand the ARC system, you start to bring in these television shows, pop culture licenses. Then we're going to come across, and at that point, I should probably not jump ahead. At that point, the industry and collectible card games are sort of seeing, the light of the candle starting to fade. Like these sort of things that, Magic can survive. The couple of other key ones can survive. Maybe Legend of the Five Rings, maybe Star Wars because they have a strong enough license and strong enough fan base, respectively. But interestingly, something changes at the end of 1998 and coming into the early 1999. And a big thing happens to the young, youthful culture that had never happened ever before. And probably hasn't happened since, and a new property from Japan came over, and Wizards of the Coast was lucky enough to be able to be the ones in charge of that game. So for those who don't know what I'm talking about, of course, I'm talking about the huge innovation that was Pokemon, which up until that point, collectible card games or trading card games hadn't really been targeted towards kids. Pokemon was sort of the first one that sort of broke that threshold and sort of said, hey, kids want to collect this sort of stuff too. So you were at Wizards of the Coast at the time for when Pokemon started to be introduced. You guys were very counterculture, doing a lot of products that were aimed at college students and sort of young adults and maybe even teenagers and stuff like that. All of a sudden you start to hear about, this Pokemon thing. Tell me about that experience and how you guys sort of saw this property from Japan that I'm sure nobody understood at the time coming into the business.
I can't speak a lot to what the executives thought necessarily, but we started to get pretty excited when we started seeing, hearing about it. And I remember, I'm not sure exactly how long after it was published, but we got some cards in and we got people translating it. One of my fellow designers in WotC R&D, Robert Gachera, spoke Japanese. And so we were able, between that and getting better translated copies of the cards and stuff, we were able to sort of piece together how the game worked. And we thought this is very cool and very interesting, and that it would definitely appeal to kids and things like that. And the picture, and of course, this is, you know, right around this time, you're also starting to hear about the cartoon and like just this whole like blitz of like Pokemon's not just like this little card game that's doing well in Japan. They're like going hard and doing a whole bunch of, and of course the video game and everything. Like all of these things are hugely popular. So yeah, it was a very interesting time and very cool to see what these people were doing with it. So
as the guy at the time who was sort of like the everything other than Magic guy, what was your role when Pokemon started to come into Wizards of the Coast? And what was the earliest expectations from you know, your business side of things? What were you guys hoping that it would do prior to it actually being released?
Well, we knew it was exploding in Japan. By the time we'd forged that partnership, we had big expectations for what it would do for us too. Like, and you know, the whole time we'd been talking about, like, you know, whether reaching out to new demographics, like when Magic and Jeet and Jihad and Netrunner and things, like the hobby at the time was not nearly as inclusive as it is now, so you know, those were sort of seen as boys' properties and things like that. So even when we were working on like Xena and Hercules, there was a lot of whispers about like, well, hopefully this will be a more inclusive game and bring more women into CCGs and things like that. And so with Pokemon and of course Yu-Gi-Oh is not too far behind, we're looking at like, you know, oh, this is awesome. Getting kids involved in this will be great for us. So I was actually one of the two designers who was picked. Myself and Robert Gachera actually were the two designers who was picked to work on Pokemon from our side.
Okay, and what does that entail? Because Pokemon obviously imports the game design from Japan, so usually you guys are used to putting words on cards. What does game design mean when it's in this sort of translated fashion from the, I guess, Game Freak on that side of Japan?
Yeah. No, Game Freak does the video game. Creatures does the card.
Oh, Creatures, yeah.
Well, mostly it's about getting the translations and trying to turn them into English and template things and make sure that we understand how they're supposed to work and get everything right. We did not make the cards. Creatures made the cards. We tried to get them right, and then our game design was about turning it into products and you know, building the first pre-constructed decks for it and things like that, and you know, making it for an American audience and marketing it and, you know, doing all the cool stuff with kids and that kind of thing. So yeah, it was a different experience because obviously we did not have much control over like what came in. We just had a lot of, you know, yeah, let's take it in, let's turn it into the products we need for our market and make the best thing we can out of it. Sure.
So that's really amazing. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pause here for a second and just to give you a bit of a parallel. While you guys are frantically sort of translating cards and changing and shifting things and being like, what does this mean? Like, what does that mean? Robert, come over here. Can you read what this word tells me? Like, how does that work in game context? While you guys are running around doing that and releasing that, not long after that, in fact, I mean, just personally, Pokemon was the thing that, you know, I am of that generation where Pokemon sort of came out. I'm wearing a Pokemon shirt right now. And it was one of those things that really sort of, you know, hit my generation, like, you know, like an anvil, or, you know, a Snorlax, let's say. And what happened was it really was it was cards first. Really, as I discovered it on the playground, it was kids like, hey, look at this colorful card, this colorful card, this colorful card. And what happened for me really was, I looked at the cards and I was very heavily involved in the Pokemon game by this stage. Perhaps being in Australia when I grew up, it was getting it a little bit later, so I'm not sure which came first. But I was like, oh, these cards don't match the types in the show. And I started to explore that. Why did some poison types have grass and stuff on them? And obviously I discovered that there was this game about it and all this stuff was balanced. It was a different game to the console games that, you know, were so famous at the time. So essentially what Pokemon did for me and what those starter decks did for me is they took the booster pack cards that I had that I cherished just as collectibles, as just these oddities with pictures on them. And I actually traded some cards for a rule book initially from Pokemon, and then eventually convinced my parents, once I figured out there was a game involved, talked them into buying those starter sets. You know, like I think Zap Out and Bushfire and all that sort of stuff. Are they the ones you're talking about you worked on?
Yep, those are the ones we made.
That's amazing. So that's fantastic. That's a personal connection. And honestly, the reason that I'm so invested in this genre in and of itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was huge fun to make those. I have such good memories because like we did mall tours. That was when we started like going out and not just going to Gen Con and Origins and conventions that were going on, but like going to a mall and sitting down there and all the kids coming in, and we've got Pokemon everywhere and they love the cards, and learning like how kids interact with these cards. Like Pokemon's so unique. If Magic the Gathering, nobody's like, oh, I'm going to go buy some booster packs of Magic for my collection, right? Or very, very limited numbers. But like for Pokemon, most kids who have Pokemon cards don't know how to play the game. They don't know how to play the game by the rules. They just have Pokemon cards and they trade them and they love them and they have their favorite Pokemon. And sometimes they play. This was like one of my favorite memories of going to these events. We went to one up here at this little mall, and the kids would come up, and I was the Pokemon expert. I had my professor jacket on and stuff, and they would come up and they would show me their cards, and I would say, oh, that's cool. And they'd say, you want to fight? Or you want to battle? And I'd say, yeah, let's battle. And I'd pull out a Pokemon and they'd pull out a Pokemon. And then they would explain to me which Pokemon won based on whatever logic they had at the time or something like that. And it was just awesome to see them like, interacting in that way and trying to, pull in what they knew from the cartoon and with the cards they had and things like that. It was an amazing experience and taught me a lot about like how kids interact with things. So
it's absolutely amazing. And obviously, I'm sure my story isn't unique. People probably got those cards because they were Pokemon cards, but then eventually started to learn to play the game, or, like there was a Game Boy game that was out around about the same time that taught a lot of people how to play and everything like that, like specifically for the card side of things. And
I love that game. The card game on the thing was so good.
Absolutely. I loved it too. It emulated the original game, so it felt comfortable in that space, but was easy to hold your hand through that. And I'm sure that game and the Pokemon Pokemon trading card game is a game that really sort of has embraced an entire generation in the same way Magic had done 10 years earlier almost, and shaped this whole generation into people who were invested in trading cards. Obviously, like you said, Yu-Gi-Oh! Was the next sort of thing that sort of broke that wave through. And now we have this persistent and consistent genre. If you look at 1998, people thought that the fad of collectible games is dying out. And now it's ironically here in 2022, stronger than ever. We just literally today had a Kickstarter hit $1 million for a trading card game. So first time in history. It's absolutely amazing to see what the efforts that you guys put in back then, putting so much effort into those constructed decks and helping people learn how to play, and being patient with those kids, playing the way that they want to. Maybe they connected with that, and that's the reason we have the genre we do today.
Absolutely. The influx of kids into it, and I mean, it's also sort of in gaming in general, renaissance time for gaming. The collectible games were bringing people in, like people who'd never thought about playing games. Like Magic was something that they would play at colleges and things like that. And also, I think at the time, like revolutions in video gaming, people were starting to. It was more okay. It was becoming more and more okay all the time to be a gamer, right? Like things like Madden. Like I put Madden on like a pedestal for like creating gaming as because it let people who weren't gamers, who would never be like, oh, I'm a gamer, I play games or things like that. You'd be like, or if you'd ask them, are you a gamer? They'd say, oh, no. And you'd be like, well, do you play Madden? Well, of course I play Madden. That's Madden, right? And it just made it okay, essentially. It made it comfortable, and it normalized gaming. So all of that, and that was happening in board games and in electronic games, and just now we've entered a state, and more kids were doing it, and more kids were growing up with it normalized for them. So
absolutely. Well, I mean, Madden's a great example. I hadn't actually thought about it in that space before, but obviously it gave an excuse for people who weren't really into gaming to bring that console into their home. Like Mike Tyson's Punch-Out before it, a generation before, and everything like that. It sort of helped bridge that gap between, geek culture and sort of, for lack of a better term, and I apologize, jock culture.
Exactly. And then those guys start discovering shooters, and that it opens up their mind to more things. And yeah,
Absolutely. So that's amazing. All right. The game philosophy stuff is absolutely fascinating to me. But let's jump back to the trading card game. So we're talking about Pokemon, and you obviously have major memories. We were talking about how that Wizards of the Coast was trying out this new sort of, this new sort of IP that they tried before. They tried like adult television shows like Xena and Hercules. Now they're going for this kid sort of thing. Do you have any last memories about like that sort of time at Wizards of the Coast? This sort of change, like how did you witness the company change from the impact that Pokemon brought?
Well, I mean, it was still sort of it came in and it swept in and it took over a bunch of stuff. Like at the time that Hasbro bought them, essentially, like if you just want to like put up the piles of money, like Magic and Pokemon were both right in there, hundreds of millions of dollars a year, right? Which is why Hasbro purchased Wizards of the Coast, right? But we were still like experimenting with things and doing a lot of cool stuff. Like my game Guillotine, which you mentioned, Guillotine was came out about that time. Like they were still very invested in all of this. Richard was still making games. Robo Rally, Filthy Rich, like all of these things. But we were also doing investigating other ways to do TCGs. Like you said, I worked on like 11 TCGs, and we've counted like 5 or 6 or 7 maybe. But like we got the Looney Tunes license, and we did a Looney Tunes game that was designed by my friend James Ernest, and then we did all the rest of it in house with the WCW license. Like we'd already made some inroads into various sports, and the WCW was actually really popular for us for quite a while, and it was a new style of game. Like the mechanics were a lot different than a lot of things that had come before. Like all of those things were happening at that time too, just us experimenting. And Paul, WCW, go.
Well, it's so fascinating. I had Mike Fitzgerald on the show, and we talked about that game and the legacy that game has, and the originality that it really brought, and how these sort of inspirations and starting points, be it sports or combat sort of sports or whatever, breed such new and original mechanics. Like you said, to use an example in the collectible game space, there had been a karate game, in 1995, and it essentially was just Magic that was a clone of Magic. Really, it was Magic-like. But then obviously games like this sort of bred this new innovation that we hadn't really had before, cards that would be activated outside of the game. It's really fascinating to hear about these game design things from places, much like Madden, like these spaces that you would never really expect to be associated with gaming at that particular era.
Yeah, absolutely. And they just keep coming in, and we keep working on them. And I mean, like Mike Fitzgerald's awesome. He's a friend of mine, and I love him dearly. And like he was early in CCGs with Wyvern, right? Like Wyvern was one of the first ones. Like there's like what was the TSR one? Blood Rage.
Spellfire.
No, Spellfire first. Blood Rage came later, right? Right in there. Like Wyvern was right in there at the beginning, right? So yeah. It's his, and then with WCW was very cool, and the whole like your deck is your life thing going on was very cool and innovative. And I mean, it'd been seen around a little bit, but yeah, it was a good time to be making CCGs.
That's awesome. So, all right, let's frame this, because we're coming up to something that's also really big as well. So guys have Pokemon. You guys have been working on that and doing an amazing job, introducing people like myself to the entire collectible game genre. I mean, I had seen Magic before that, and actually, to be honest with you, it sort of scared me because it was so, adult. But when, things like Pikachus and Jigglypuffs were all soft and cute and plushy, I was willing to jump in by that point. But let's talk about the next sort of big thing. So Wizards of the Coast has this huge hit with Pokemon, and then within 2 years of that, another franchise starts to rise up in sort of the young, youthful, popular culture at the time, and it becomes a sought-after license for trading card game makers, because a lot of people want to sort of replicate what happened with Magic, and that is, of course, Harry Potter. That is a Harry Potter trading card game that you guys did at Wizards of the Coast, and you're credited as one of the 3 designers on it, alongside a couple of other fantastic designers as well. Tell me about when you first start hearing about this Harry Potter license and stuff like that at Wizards of the Coast internally, and that you're going to try and pursue this sort of creating this game with this new franchise.
I do remember hearing a little bit while, we're juggling all of these games. Like at the time, most of the games you've talked about are either still in production or, working on, well, maybe not most of them by that time. But I mean, between Magic and Pokemon and even WCW and stuff, we're still doing a lot around. MLB, I think, was still hot at the time, and so it's sort of like, oh, we're all reading the books. we're all reading the Harry Potter books, and we're all like, yeah, this would be cool. This would be totally cool, and talking about ideas like we could do this, we could do that, we could do things like this.
Wait a minute, you mean they have a magical duel in this book? I recognize that from somewhere.
That's so weird. How might we replicate that? Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, and then they were like, okay, we got it. We're gonna put a team together, and we went, who all's available and stuff, and then we put our team together and just started digging in and looking at everything we'd done. I mean, you can see the WCW DNA in Harry Potter. Like, there's no doubt there. The deck is your life, that kind of thing going on in there. So yeah, we started from the let's talk about what we think the best mechanics for this are going to be. Okay, deck is your life, or are you going to have a life total? Are these guys actually going to fight, or are they going to try to complete quests and things, and all of that stuff going on? And we took all of the DNA from we worked on Pokemon, and we know that while Harry Potter is hugely popular with everybody, that the game is sort of more pushed towards kids and stuff. So we used all of our learnings from C23 and Xena and Hercules from the ARC system about making simpler games, from what we had from Pokemon, from what we had from WCW. You can see all of that DNA in there when you're looking at it, for sure.
That's really amazing. So tell me a little bit more about what was going on behind the scenes. Obviously, you were working at Wizards of the Coast just up to, while that design was starting to happen and take shape. Do you guys, and to be honest with you, there was a couple of other games that were released as contemporaries to that game that sort of had a similar theme, suspiciously, because a lot of companies were sort of vying for that license and that same sort of trying to actually become the Harry Potter trading card game. Obviously, Wizards was the one who ended up publishing it. Do you guys remember if you started working on it before you had confirmed if that was going to be a thing? Do you know anything about that?
I don't think we'd really worked on it before we had it confirmed. Because like I said, as soon as they said we're putting a team together, go. I mean, it might have been before the ink was dry. It might have been before things were signed. It might have been like, hey, we're in meetings and we think we're going to get this license, so we're putting a team together. Like my 25 years ago or 20 years ago knowledge about exactly all of that isn't as clear as I would like. But definitely right around that time, and it was sort of like, we're in this. Go think about what it would look like. So yeah, absolutely. And the other games that came out at the time that have sort of similar themes are definitely looks like they were hoping to get the license and were building a game, and then Wizards got it. So
I think it ended up being a much loved game that many people still actually play today, and actually has had a huge resurgence in the last sort of 2 or 3 years.
I get a surprising number of people on Twitter asking me Harry Potter questions, and I have to dig back down. It's like, wait, okay, no, how did we make those interactions work? And yeah, totally.
Well, speaking of those interactions, of course, tell me, what do you remember about the design process of that game? Like we talked about earlier with Netrunner, what are some of the things you might remember you experimented with? Factioning in the game seems like, you broke it up into lesson types, but, my mind would go, oh, well, what about the Hogwarts houses? Tell me all about, if there's anything you remember from the sort of crafting side of things. Like you said, you took so many lessons in. What did you throw away, and what didn't we see?
Well, I mean, we did a lot of things. I mean, since we started from sort of bare bones, I think I remember us working on well, what if the game was about Quidditch?
No, save that for an expansion.
Right. Well, yes, and we did it in an interesting way that was already within the game thing. But I think I remember us talking about maybe it should be a game about Quidditch, and that'll be interesting to the people who read it. And the reason we went with the types of magic instead of the schools is just more sort of about I seem to remember us discussing well, there actually aren't that many characters in some of these schools and stuff, and it's more interesting when the characters in general team up, even though they're in different houses, to do interesting things and things like that. So yeah, totally.
I really, I love that sort of consideration that you took, that obviously, you know, this wasn't just about breaking it up into factioning or anything like that. You guys wanted to tell a story with the game as well. So do you remember anything else that you want to share about that sort of time? Like, you know, like you said, when it was Xena and Hercules time, you got to fly to Universal and look through pictures. Do you have any memories of working on the Harry Potter license in a similar capacity?
No, we didn't. I never got to fly to England and meet JK or anything. And none of that. That would have definitely been exciting at the time for me to get to do, or you know, go to the sets because the movies were on. I think we were just working with the book. So, but we didn't get to, you know, be involved in any of that kind of stuff. We just kind of took it in and what we knew about it and started building around it, basically. So
another personal story. I mean, speaking of not having the movies to work with, that game sort of came out alongside the first movie. But the thing that really sort of blew my mind is it had such vibrant and original art from originally, you know, a lot of Magic the Gathering artists and all that sort of stuff that were reinterpreting this world in a way we'd never seen it before. So I think that's something that really has captured a lot of imagination. You know, it is this alternative universe of the Harry Potter storytelling that's not told anywhere else. It's not told in Pottermore, and it's not shaped by the way that the movies looked yet. It's a really fascinating thing. Do you have any other memories you want to share finally before we wrap up with Harry Potter?
Not too much. I mean, I agree with you. I really did like the fact that we were given a certain amount of freedom to like put stuff in and let people play with it in ways that they hadn't been able to before. They were able to mix and match and tell a story about this character and this character, you know, doing a Quidditch match or doing a thing, right, that hadn't really been available before or had been more locked down for storytelling and things like that. So that was very exciting, definitely.
So if I'm not mistaken, like I mean, it was such a beautiful game. And like I said, many people still love it nowadays and stuff like that. And like you said, a lot of people are reaching out and asking you all these sorts of questions. So thank you very much for putting that in. It was another game that, because of Pokemon, which was the gateway for me, it was one that I was happy to explore afterwards, and then has led me down this trail of trying to play every single game I can possibly get my hands on. Now, I guess around this time, if I'm not mistaken, this is about when you start to move away from Wizards of the Coast and for that matter, collectible games at the time.
Yeah, actually, yeah, right around then. Right after the Hasbro acquisition, we were, you know, continuing to work on stuff and everything was going fine. And then in 2000, the company and I were no longer together.
Right. Well, we won't pry too much into what that all goes into, but you know, that's corporate America, you know. So do you have any final memories? You know, we spoke before the mics got turned on that this show is about the games, but it's also about the revolution that collectible card games sort of brought about, and also the culture and the people involved. Do you have any other memories or favorite memories from your time working at Wizards of the Coast that you want to share, or you want to just, you know, let people know about or anything like that? Because I would love to hear anything that was going on there, you know, whether it was fun stuff. I've heard about fun days that you guys used to do, theme days, everything.
Yeah, I mean, we used to do so much fun stuff. I mean, I have millions of stories, like going to Gen Con and like, you know, we came in and we were the young guys in Gen Con, essentially, like these companies that had been around for years, and we came in and exploded essentially, and there was a lot of friendships made and a lot of enemies made, corporate enemies and things. So like all of that, but then, you know, like the stories about how Wizards of the Coast acquired TSR in the late 90s. And there's huge stories there about like TSR wasn't going to sell to Wizards of the Coast. So it went through another company and
there was some brokering going on. In fact, if you want to hear about that, go watch my John Zinzer episodes.
Yes, absolutely. John Zinzer, yeah, he definitely tells those stories better than me. But like, those times were so amazing. Like John and I became friends back then because I was a Wizard of the Coast collectible card game designer and he had L5R. He showed me L5R before it came out. He was like, we met at a convention. He was like, hey, do you want to see what we're working on? And we talked about it. And he like, John's an amazing guy.
Yeah.
It was that kind of industry at the time too. You know, Wizards was like, I was the 75th employee, and when I left, there were like over 1,000 employees. So the huge growth, the huge like just getting things done. Like those early days, we were in a, you know, one level of a like almost a strip mall kind of business park kind of thing.
A precursor to the Googleplex.
Yeah, exactly. And we were on old Boeing desks, like these big metal monstrosity desks that were leftovers from Boeing that we bought. And we had an open floor plan because we didn't have time to buy cubes or anything. Like it was just literally like one huge room full of desks with different departments and things, and a couple offices around the outside edge. And then from there, we like took over part of the next building, and then eventually we moved to this cool 4-sided structure. It was 4 buildings around a central court with 2 stories each.
In the mana pool?
And with the mana pool right in the middle of it. Exactly. And then we had like a little and then like when we opened the place in downtown Seattle, in the University District, our first store with like, it was huge, and it had video games and tournament structures downstairs and everything. Like there's just again and again and again, and like getting TSR and getting into all of that. Like while I was there, not only did I work on all of this stuff, but I like they handed me 2 Marvel adventures that had been written and had me rewrite them while I was there. Like so, I worked on Marvel. I worked on just so many things.
Oh my wow! Well, so few people have the luxury or the privilege to stand on the precipice of a industry revolution, and especially one that is based around crafting fun like you did. It's an absolutely amazing story, and I'm sure we could do a podcast for each sentence you just mentioned just there.
Yeah, totally. And I haven't even begun to tell stories about like going when Gen Con was in Milwaukee and going to the Safe House, which is like the most amazing bar in the world. And
so nonetheless, all right, well, okay, so I have 2 more questions, and then we're going to go to the community questions, and we're going to wrap up the episode. So my 2 questions, and only one of them is improvised because you mentioned him there, and he's a big, he's means a lot to me as well as a designer and as a businessman. John Zinzer, you work with him a little bit later on a unique kind of collectible game, a collectible chip game, not one that many people hear about. Can you give me sort of like the 2-minute version of how Clout Fantasy came about, which is you'll tell it what it is.
Well, so Clout is the brainchild of Jesper Mirfors. Jesper is he's amazing, and he was like when you look at the back of a Magic card, he did that. He was a graphic designer. He was the head of art for Wizards of the Coast for a while, and he and I have been friends for years. And after I left Wizards, and I went to work on electronic games, and then I came back to the Seattle area. Jesper's like, hey, I've got this game idea. You want to work on it together? And we started working on it. And the idea was basically, it's on poker chips. I don't know if I have any here. Anyways, it's on poker chips, and they have stats on them. They have a picture and stats. It's like a poker chip representation of a card, but the game is physical. It's
dexterity.
Yeah, it's a dexterity game. You have a stack of chips, and you can choose any one of them, and then you throw it onto the field, and where it lands in relation to other chips lets it either attack them or it sets up a field that defends them. Like it's sort of it's a very magic-y kind of a thing. They've got stats and abilities, but it's also about like you could have your best chip for the moment and throw it, and it goes rolling off the field way over there somewhere and totally screws everything up. So and it was a pleasure to work with. Not only that, but so Jesper was the original designer on it, and he brought me on board, and we're working. And then we decided to form a company around it, and we went to Peter Atkinson, who started Wizards of the Coast, and he was there was sort of the 3 of us coming together to make that game happen. So we started a company, we started putting that game out, and we did that for a couple of years. And then the company entirely morphed to a different sort of collectible thing. So
it's absolutely amazing. Speaking of things we could talk another whole podcast about, I would love to dig into how that all happened, all that sort of stuff. It's absolutely amazing. But in the interest of time, unfortunately, I will move on to my my last question, which is actually something that is sort of like something that's happening in the gaming space at the moment. And it's something that I mentioned it in the introduction. For lack of a better term, you are the father of a mechanic in gaming that, as far as I know, called shuffle building, which is where it's essentially, like you mentioned, it's like Smash Up, where you'll put 2 decks together and shuffle them together, and it will become a entirely new sort of deck, and it's how you'll choose your strategy. It's basically one-step deck building.
Yes, exactly, 100%. That was exactly my impetus of it, is to take the essence of deck building and make it sort of as simple and approachable as possible. Just like I want these 2 things I'm going to put them together. And like all the original designs for Smash Up are much different than they were now because they were all in service to, I want to be able to take zombies and pirates, and they both feel like zombies and pirates, and I'm going to put them together and I'm going to play a game with that. And so there were much more magic-y versions of the game, and there was Richard wanted me to do a version of it that was like chess, like on a chessboard, but the moves were like you're doing piratey moves when you play pirate cards and zombie moves when you do zombie, which was fun and cool. And I worked on that for a little bit, and then eventually transformed into Smash Up. So very interestingly, you were mentioning John Zinzer. When we were doing Clout, John Zinzer was, or AEG was our business partner. Hidden City Games made Clout, and John Zinzer was our business partner. And that's where we like became even better friends, is they were the ones that put out Clout essentially, right? It was an AEG/Hidden City Games project. And so then when I had a game, Smash Up, one of the first people I talked to about it was John, and he was basically like, hey, have you shown this to anybody else? And I was like, yeah, a couple of people. He's like, listen,
Don't.
exactly. A partnership almost instantly formed on it. So yeah.
That's fantastic. And I love that we got that little bit of history in there. Now, over the last couple of years, since Smash Up came out, it's obviously become a bit of a staple in the hobby game space. And it's something I'm sure if you walk into any sort of, LGS or FLGS, as they're called, you'll find Smash Up on the shelves. And in the last couple of years, especially this year, and maybe even last year or the year before, a couple of other games have built out this similar concept. In fact, Magic themselves have even done something similar with the Jumpstart series. Do you have any perspective on that? Was that something that was you were notified of?
No, not at all. Like, it's tough to say, like nobody like when Ascension came out and when all of these deck builders started coming out, everybody said, Donald X, like he made Dominion, like this is it. But like and everybody should pay homage to him for doing so, but it's hard to say like that's my mechanic, what are you doing, right?
Yeah. Oh, and no way would I expect you to, pull rank on them or anything like that. But I was just wondering what your perspective on that is, as in a collectible space where there's these various different things that you can open in like a randomized fashion, but use it in this shuffle building way. Now, Justin Gary, again, another former guest of the show, a couple of times, has Keyforge Fusion out, which uses that same mechanic. Just give me your perspective on that sort of stuff.
I think it's awesome. I'm a big believer in, as long as you're not like actually stealing something, that like, a high tide raises all boats, right? The more that people are piling in, more games that are like Smash Up makes people more aware of Smash Up, and that's great for me. And I'm totally excited and totally like one of the first things that happened after Smash Up came up. One of the first games that was Epic PvP came out from very good friends of mine, made that game and put it out. And I was like, yeah, go for it. This is amazing. And AEP was like, yeah, this is so amazing. We're going to publish it. Bring it on over here. Right. So
it's so interesting you mentioned that. My previous episode, if anybody wants to watch it, was with Luke Peterson.
Oh yeah, Luke, you're just like naming off all of my best friends. Luke and I designed a game a couple of years ago that may come out at some point.
I know, I can't believe that didn't come out. Anyway.
Yes.
I wanted that so bad. JRPG. Anyway, this might get cut.
It's okay.
All right. So my question then is, obviously taking Magic the Gathering and taking SoulForge into consideration, do you have any vision for Smash Up having a collectible component? Do you think that Smash Up could work as individual decks that you could sell that were maybe randomized, or half decks that you could sell that were randomized, that you could sell to already Smash Up intentioned players that might have new themes and stuff like that?
I mean, I would never say never, especially because I love exploring the spaces that we have there. But like so much of the heart of Smash Up is about like, I have my pirate deck and it feels like pirates, right? And to get it more randomized I could imagine that there would be factions that would be interesting if they were randomized, or, make a faction that's actually like 60 cards and you shuffle it up and you take 20 of the cards and that's what you play with. Like, there are lots of mechanical, interesting things in that space, but I don't think, and 5 years from now when we do it or something, I'll be wrong. But we haven't talked about any of that, and because I think really it is the heart of like you want to take pirates and you want to match them with zombies and you want to see what that is. And you want it to feel like you took pirates and zombies and put them together and made a deck out of it, right? And you're going to lose a lot of that. It totally works for Jumpstart in some sense because their themes are sort of more loose, right? Like, oh, it's goblin. You get the goblin deck and there are so many goblins that you can make a cool thing out of it, right? So maybe if we made like 60 pirate cards and you could use 20 of them, that might be something that could happen. But I don't think so. I think it's just so much the heart of, and we work so hard to like craft those 20 cards to be as perfect as possible and to work with the other 50 factions that exist. And
it's just such a fascinating meeting of these, you know, this experience that you've had and these games that you've designed and sort of everything dovetailing back together. It's just something I wanted to get your perspective on.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like I said, I think what Jumpstart is doing is amazing. It's so awesome, and other people, you know, then the Soulforge stuff working on that. I think that's perfect, and it's you know, I mean, I don't know how much they thought like, yeah, look what Smash Up's doing. We're going to do something cool and similar, or whether it was parallel and they came at it from another angle, which I could also totally see. But it's just very heartening to see that other people were doing cool things with similar ideas to what I had.
It's a really cool space, and I'm very excited about it. As somebody who has, as an adult, less and less time, the quicker the deck building process becomes, the more engaged I feel like I should be in the game. Like, I'm super excited for Soulforge and stuff like that. So again, as a father of shuffle building, thank you so much for the mechanic.
Sure.
So, okay, we have a couple of things to do before we wrap up, and we have community questions right now, which is a couple of questions from the listeners of this show who might have been interested in some of the stuff we talked about. Before we get started in this sort of segment, though, I do want to thank a couple of people whose questions might have gotten answered in the body of the episode, and we'll skim over those. So thank you very much, Ludi World. He's a huge game store in France, and he does a lot of stuff, but his favorite game is Netrunner, and I'm sure you spoke to some amazing stuff when we talked about that. Thank you for long-time listener Jens Boren. He has also submitted a bunch of questions as well, and we sort of talked about some of the stuff that he wanted to talk about. And finally, I want to we don't have time for it now, but I want to thank Wellness Rain on Twitter, who asked about the Looney Tunes game. You mentioned it. We don't have time to really dig into it. And it was one of the games that I didn't really have a ton of questions for initially, but I think it's a fantastic property. Maybe if we ever speak again, we'll be able to expand that a little bit more. So for the community questions, I do want to start with Michael's question from Twitter. And he says that with the success of the Harry Potter IP, how did you feel that about the game not seeing that same sort of success to scale?
Well, I mean, I think that one of our problems was that when the game released, all of the kids who wanted CCGs had Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! So we were up against Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! With them. And while Harry Potter is a more youthful kind of thing, it doesn't really dig down as deep as Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! Right? And a lot of the adults that were playing were either playing Magic or in the 2000s, maybe Lord of the Rings and things like that. So I think as awesome as it is for those of us who are so deeply Harry Potter fans and things like that, I think it kind of was missing its mark when it hit, right? So it got a very good cult following, but I don't think it really exploded the way it could have exploded. And I don't know that it was as discoverable to those fans as it could have been, right? It wasn't necessarily in those bookstores and things like that. So yeah, I think some of it was just about like discovery by the right people and things like that. So.
That's, I mean, I think that is one of the things. Obviously, like we mentioned earlier, the movie started to come out and the look of the entire franchise started to shift and change so much as well. Away from, you know, what the books sort of had promised initially. You know, everybody's, I think if you ask, you know, 90% of people nowadays, when they think of Harry Potter, think of what Daniel Radcliffe and his contemporaries have sort of laid out. Whereas that book, that game was sort of embodying a sort of pre-movie Harry Potter.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. So let's jump to the next question. It's by Exoran on Twitter as well. He asks a little bit more of a broader question, and you might not have too much to speak to about this because it is more of the art side. But can you speak to anything about Wizards of the Coast using that sort of innovative sort of 3D art for Netrunner? Like, obviously, it's a computer-generated game and everything like that. But can you speak to anything that you sort of saw at that time, or any of the discussions, or anything that happened that led to that sort of thing?
Just that we were definitely so like we worked really closely with Pondsmith on that, like the license holder for Cyberpunk, right? And he's an amazing designer in his own right. And just like we definitely wanted it to feel like you were running the net. So everything needs to look, and that art style is what computer animation looked like at the time. Like if you look even like Reboot and shows like that, and
Lawnmower Man, that sort of stuff.
Right, yeah, exactly. So it was very natural to sort of capture that and be like, well, what are you actually doing? Well, when you're in the net, this is what things should look like. And then when you're, driving around, then you're using the more cyberpunky, neon art that's on some of the other cards for things that happened in the real world.
It was one of those things that I think is amazing. And I think that juxtaposition between that sort of internal net art and that sort of more, traditional fantasy artist or RPG artist things was one of the things that really elevates it, obviously with the rule system we talked about earlier, above some of those other games.
Yeah, absolutely. Very innovative. And, I don't remember, but I remember thinking at the time that it was a little risky to be doing that kind of artwork when so many of the other games were around were either using photos from movies or like high quality art. Like Magic at the time was, had amazing fantasy art and things like that. So yeah, but I think it worked and people obviously enjoyed it.
I think it's amazing that was the product that ended up coming out. Now, our last community question is from Sam L. And they ask, it's actually a very interesting question. You've often said that the Callous Guards and Guillotine were your biggest mistake as a game designer.
Yes, it is. It's horrible.
Okay, so that's a card in Guillotine, obviously, or Guillotine, rather. Is there a CCG or TCG card you have the same feeling about?
Oh, that's a really good question. That's interesting. I mean, I'm sure there is. I would have to think about it though. Like
maybe with a couple more weeks or months or something like that. Maybe perhaps if we talk again in the future, you'll have an answer for that.
Yes. Yeah, I'll start thinking about it and start going through the sets. Let me look through Apocalypse and see if there's a card that I just really hated that we made and I can't believe we made.
Yeah. And we didn't even get a chance to talk about the fact that, you designed that Magic set, you did development on a bunch of others, you led Design Apocalypse. So we have one last thing to do before the episode wraps up, and that is, of course, the Kraken Questions segment.
Release the Kraken.
And in this segment, you choose a color booster pack of extra interview questions, and I crack it open and ask you these randomized questions. So you tell me which color, blue, red, or yellow. I'll crack it open, and we will go out on those questions.
Okay, let's do red.
Red it is. All right, let's see what's behind the red booster pack in Kraken Questions. All right, so these can be random, silly questions. There might be 3 common silly questions and 1 rare game designer question. So we have got... other than your hometown, what is your favorite city for your first common question?
Honolulu. I went to Hawaii for the first time a couple of years ago and I fell in love with it.
That's awesome. I haven't been yet, but I would love to on a stopover going back to Australia. It's obviously on the way. Oh, okay. Here's an interesting question. Common question. What is your favorite collectible card game that you haven't been involved with professionally?
Wow. That's a good question because my tastes and things like that change like a lot over time. Like at one point, it was definitely Shadow Fist. Shadow Fist is an amazing game. I love Shadow Fist. I still to this day, I haven't played it in forever, but I still to this day love it. So I think I'll go with that because it's the one that I remember loving the most. But I've over time have played so many. And the World of Warcraft CCG, I played the heck out of that for years. And yeah.
I mean, both of those are great. Obviously, Shadow Fist has a whole personal connection in my heart. I love that game. All right, so your third common question. Would you rather be a Jedi or a Vulcan?
Jedi.
I mean, I think that's a bit of a...
not even, let's set aside lightsabers and things like that. Just like and let's be kind about the prequels, but in the prequels, the abilities of fully fledged Jedi who had been training for years were revealed. And it's like, I'm just going to jump off of a building and land in a car that's zooming by. I'm there.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they do seem a little overpowered by comparison. I think that's a broken card. All right, so your final rare question for the Booster Pack Kraken Questions episode segment is, and it doesn't have to be a collectible game, but which published game did you struggle with designing the most? And if you could change something about it, what would it be?
That's a good question. Which one did I struggle with the most? I made a game called Ninth World for Lone Shark Games, and it was the reason I struggled with it the most was mostly about it being it's a very complicated game, and it took a lot of iterations to get it right. And it actually went through a couple of different IPs while we were doing it. It started with one IP, and then it ended up in the ninth. It was actually designed for a different. Oh, no, it was pretty much Ninth World from the beginning, but like it went through a couple of different iterations of like who was actually going to be publishing it. And so there were a lot of things like around the game itself that were difficult, as well as the game being very complicated but also super fun. It's kind of a hand building game. You start with a hand, and every round you get a little better with it, and you use it to interact with things on the board. So that would probably be the one that I've had overall the most trouble in my life with, but it's still an awesome game, and overall it was a great experience.
That's awesome. Well, I mean, like I said, I've seen it. I haven't played it yet, but I would love to really give it a go. And it looks like that hand mechanic is really innovative and stuff. So thank you so much for joining me on today's episode, Paul. Before we go, let people know where they can find you if you're on social media, or even if you've got any other projects coming out. We spoke a lot about Smash Up. I'm sure there's something coming down the line for that.
Right. You mentioned a little bit the Disney game is going to be coming out. Like Marvel came out last year, and Disney's coming out this year. So we're definitely doing some cool stuff in the Smash Up space. I have a game coming out from Devere sometime. I don't know if they've announced it yet. I have a game coming out from Devere. So look up me and Devere and see if you can find something. Social media, I think I always forget what my Twitter handle is. I think it's Werewolf00, which is WAREWOLF00. And that's where I get a lot of interesting questions about Harry Potter games and things like that. So that's where you can find me.
I'll make sure it's linked in the description as well. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation that could have went on another 10 hours, no doubt. There was a bunch of...
Happy to. Let's go.
There is another bunch of rabbit holes we could have well and truly jumped down today. But for this episode, that's going to do it. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Booster Pack. Goodbye from me. Goodbye from you, Paul.
Thank you very much for having me. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Until next time, remember, keep shuffling. And there you have it, our episode with Paul Peterson. Thank you so much, Paul, for those amazing, amazing stories. And thank you so much for you guys for watching. There is somebody else I want to thank in this episode as well, and that is Sean Kahn, somebody who helped connect me with Paul for this episode. And without him, he was a previous guest on the show who also told similar amazing stories about his time at early Wizards of the Coast. He worked with Paul on a VtES. So if you want to hear his side of that story, go check that episode out as well. So thank you so much, Sean, as well, for helping us connect. Finally, as well, I just want to say again, a thank you to Paul for sharing some of those stories. As I'm sure you guessed and heard in the episode, there was so much more I wanted to dig into. And hopefully at one point, much down the line, we'll be able to talk to Paul again and sort of fill in some of the gaps that we missed today. Hey, you guys can even let me know now some of the things that you might have been interested to hear about that might have got missed in this episode. So let me know in the comments here, or even email me via our email address, which is theboosterpack@ccghistory.com. Or even if you have anything more long form to say to me, you can let me know there, whether that's a review of the show or critique, or even some feedback, or whether that's just something you want to tell me, or some how you got into gaming or anything like that. Let me know via that email address. Again, it'll be in the description or show notes of this episode. Also, you can reach out to me on social media. I, of course, am on Facebook and Twitter. That is facebook.com/CCG History and twitter.com/CCG History, or simply at CCG History. If you're going to make a post on either of those platforms, you'll be able to get me and tag me there as well. Finally, as well, in the description, if you have a little look down, you'll be able to find that we have a very special listener survey that you can fill out that will tell me what sort of games you started to enjoy and what sort of era you started to play collectible games in. So I can start to tailor and shift the sort of episodes to what you want to hear about if you fill out the listener survey. So let me know via there as well. Finally, I just want to mention, if there was any games in this episode that you were sort of interested in sort of getting into, or maybe you have a collection of and you want to add to, check out Category 1 Games. They're a online store that specializes in classic collectible card games. And I think that they have an absolutely fantastic customer service and pretty reasonable market prices. Obviously, we've seen these kind of games explode over the last couple of years, but they've tried to keep the prices as reasonable as possible. So go check them out. They'll be linked in the description as well. So thank you so much for joining me. Until next time, I cannot wait to bring you the very next episode, but I've said it once. I will, of course, as always, say it again. Keep track.